Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of The Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Alecia Carter. She is Associate Professor in the Department of Anthropology at University College London. She researches how primates respond to the deaths of others and what this can tell us about the evolution of cognition and emotion. That's thanatology, and we're going to get into that, and how individuals access information to make decisions. And we're also going to talk a little bit about Dr. Carter's work on animal personality and culture. So Dr. Carter, welcome to the show. It's a big pleasure to have you on.
Hello, Ricardo. It's a massive pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
So, okay, let's start with thanatology then. It was just fairly recently that I first got into it on the show with the Spanish philosopher, Dr. Susana Monzó. Could you tell us first what biologists specifically study in this particular subfield?
Yeah, so thanatology is, for biologists that study non-human animals, we want to understand what animals perceive about death and what they understand about death. And for me, this is broken up into two bigger questions. One is the cognitive aspect, which I'm sure that you spoke to Dr. Monzó about. And that's like whether animals have a concept of death and whether they understand the difference between death and dying. And there's also the emotional aspect, which I think more biologists and certainly more primatologists are interested in. So what is the emotional response to having lost a loved one to death? So thanatology is understanding, animals' responses to the deaths of others with those big questions in mind.
By the way, we're going to get into specific examples that you have studied, but just generally speaking, do you think that at this point in time, looking at the evidence we have from evolutionary biology about how different kinds of animals react to the deaths of others, do you think there's good enough evidence to support the idea of some non-human animals having a sort of minimum concept of death, as Dr. Monzó, for example, calls it?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So the question is, if it's about evidence, I don't think we have enough. First of all, I don't think we even have what we would consider to be good evidence for that. So I think this is where I'm really excited about where philosophy and biology, that intersection meets. Like I really like Susana Monzó's work is amazing because it gives biologists something to test. But in terms of evidence for it, I think no, not yet. I'm not definitively one way or another. I think this is a complete digression and I apologize for that. And we'll probably circle back to this. But there's a big problem with cognition because the same evidence can be interpreted differently by cognitively reductionist interpretations or cognitively enhancing interpretations. So even if you do have evidence, somebody could always argue that, like if you're taking a behaviorist approach, that there's just like a learned association between two things. So in terms of cognition, it's a really tricky one to get at.
And I would imagine that it's complicated also for humans, right? Because there's also perhaps some assumptions that we make about how humans in general, even cross-culturally, think, or how our psychology works, that perhaps is not really universal, I guess. So perhaps some of the complications that we have, I guess we could say, when studying the psychology of other animals would also apply to humans, at least to some extent.
It's a tricky one. For the concept of death, I think Susana Monzó's work points out that at least the minimal concept of death, I think all humans can share this. Like death is a cessation of function and an irreversibility. You can't go back. And I think when you get to the more complicated parts of humans' understanding of death, when we start to think about what happens after we're dead, then culture becomes incredibly important, and how we how we conceptualize what the transition is from being alive to dead, then that I think is cross-culturally very difficult to pin down. But in terms of like the actual mechanism, then I think it's very difficult. Well, I'm not a cultural anthropologist, so I shouldn't make broad generalizations, but I think that most people, although they would believe in a spirit, they would never think that that spirit can become a human again. So that irreversibility remains through, and I think that's true across cultures as well. So those fundamentals that Susanna Monceau's work points out, I think most human cultures, I'm going to say most, share those ideas.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so getting into your work specifically, which primates have you done thanatology work on?
So at this point, well, I got into it. I work with a long-term field project that studies baboon behavior in the wild. Yeah. And so most of my observations of primates' responses to the deaths of others have come from that work, actually. So I can say a lot about baboons' responses. But I did have a student who tried to compare across as many primates as we could find records for. So I have a general idea of at least primates generally how they respond to the deaths of infants, and particularly the mothers, how they respond. Yeah.
But let's focus on baboons then. So how do they respond to the deaths of infants? And I mean, in this case, have you studied the mother's responses or also the responses of other individuals?
Yeah, so both, but only because of the circumstances of a few of the deaths that we've had. So I should preface this with, like, it's very rare to see at least a baboon find the corpse of a non-infant. And so most of the data that we have are on mothers' responses to infants' corpses. Okay. And we usually have mothers' responses because they're the ones that are attached, obviously, to their offspring, and are usually present when the infant dies. And so generally speaking, we have the majority of cases are mothers' responses to the infant's deaths. In those cases, before I get on to the other cases, in those cases, the responses are always, at least in baboons, from what I've seen at my site and generally what I've read in the literature, the responses are always very caring. I guess it's a very anthropological loaded term loaded term to say that they're caring, but we don't necessarily see any violence directed towards infants' corpses as we would observe towards non-infant corpses, which does happen in other species. And so generally the mothers, they'll carry the corpse, they'll groom the corpse, they'll protect the corpse from others who are approaching, particularly observers. They get very protective of the corpse. And other individuals in the troop seem to know that that corpse belongs to a particular mother. So if the mother moves away from the corpse to forage, the other members of the troop will be alert when somebody else approaches the corpse. There have been a couple of times at my field site where the mother has died before the infant, and the infant itself has subsequently died, which is very rare. Obviously, the infant it can't survive without its mother, and it usually survives for about 1 or 2 days after the mother dies before it succumbs to dehydration and malnutrition. And it's a horrible thing to witness in the field. But in both of those cases that I've seen, other members of the troop end up doing the caring behaviors. So they carry the infant both when it's alive, but also after it's died, and they'll groom the infant when it's alive, but also after it's died. They don't carry for as long as mothers. So mothers at our field site, they can carry on average for about 2 days, but they will sometimes carry for up to 10 days. And in all of the cases that we've seen with others, non-mothers carrying the corpses, it's usually for a few hours, at most 12 hours to a day. So it seems to be that there's like a very caring response to infants' corpses.
But usually, I mean, this behavior of carrying the corpse of an infant, it usually doesn't last long, or does it?
No. So, well, I guess it depends on how you define long. So across all the species that we've looked at, the average carrying duration is 2 days. They're really heavy, actually. A corpse that doesn't cling onto you, it's a really energetically expensive activity to do. So already carrying it for any length of time, I think is surprising. And not all primates do this, but most primates do. If there is a corpse, then they tend to carry their infants' corpses with them. And like I said, not all of them do that, and not all mothers do that. But in general, it seems to be something that they do. I will point out that some people have argued, like the very first interpretations of this behavior when it was observed were to suggest that the mothers were doing this because they didn't realize that their offspring was dead, so that there seemed to be a cognitive, they just didn't have the cognitive capacity to realize that they're dead immediately, and so they carry it for longer. But from what I've seen in the field, I don't think this is true, or at least I don't think it's very good evidence, because they carry the corpse very differently. They take far less care with it. So although they perform these caring behaviors, they do try to clutch the infant to their chest. They interact with the corpse in a very different way. And it's very different to injured offspring. So, for example, there are a couple of pretty horrific injuries we've seen in infants, and the mothers will, for example, they'll revert to jockeying their infant, so putting their infant on their back when the infant was independently walking. So they modify their behavior in response to an incapacitated infant, and you don't really see that with the corpse. They're really just carrying it in the best way that they can.
I also asked you for how long you've seen baboons doing this kind of behavior, I mean, carrying their infants' corpses, because I was also wanting to ask you how we should understand or make sense of this kind of behavior from an evolutionary perspective, because I would imagine that just at first sight, people would theorize that it wouldn't make much sense, adaptively speaking, for an individual to carry a corpse, even if it's their own infant, because I mean, if it's already dead, it doesn't matter how many resources, energy, time you invest in it, because it won't come back to life. So it's basically, from an evolutionary perspective, a waste of time and resources, I guess. So, but of course, we don't necessarily need to approach every behavior from an adaptationist perspective. It could be a byproduct or of something, for example.
Yeah, 100%. It's a really, really good question, and one that I really struggle with. And I think this is what got me into studying thanatology in the first place, because I was seeing these responses that didn't seem to make any sense. My money, and I do not have the data to support this, it's just a theory that I have, but my money would be on this grief behavior being a byproduct, as you suggest, of a very strong emotional attachment to one's offspring. And so there is such strong selective pressure on there being, at least in most mammals, a very strong bond between the mother and their offspring, particularly in mothers or mammals that have very short interbirth intervals with very with offspring that they invest a lot of resources in. So these are K-selected in the evolutionary terms species. There really is strong selection on having a very strong attachment between the mother and the offspring, because their offspring survival really will affect their long-term reproductive success. And so I think that this grief emotion is just an evolutionary byproduct of love, which seems awful, but seems to make sense in terms of trying to understand why they're doing these, what are arguably, as you pointed out, maladaptive behaviors.
So, and apart from carrying behaviors, are there any other behaviors, reactions that you've seen from baboons when they react to, I guess, not only the corpses of infants, but perhaps of other conspecifics?
Yeah, so good question. So in terms of the responses, other responses to infants, there's grooming, and also I've seen them doing what is in some parts of the literature called vigils, where they'll stand next to the corpse, basically protecting the corpse from others or other things that are around. I have never seen a baboon come across an adult baboon's corpse, and so I have I don't know what they would do. I had somebody in the field who said that they did see this and they sat near it, like in a little group, lined up, just staring at the corpse, not really understanding. Well, I don't know what they understood about it. Like that's all that I got from this observer. And we tend not to see at the field site that I work at the corpses, because the group moves all together, and an individual who's about to die can't keep up with the group. And some individuals will modify their behavior in response to others, but the whole group can't do that. So they tend to get left behind, and we very rarely find or see where adult or non-infant individuals die, actually. So yeah, in other species though, it can go two ways. So for example, chimpanzees and gorillas are very well known to be incredibly violent towards corpses. So they'll start beating the corpse and hitting and dragging the corpse and displaying around it. And then in the same interaction, the same individual can then go to grooming the corpse and caring for the corpse. And there are some reports of individuals cleaning the teeth of the individual of the deceased individual. And so there seems to be a lot of conflict over these non-infant corpses. And there are no records of that, to my knowledge, of infant corpses being treated in that kind of violent manner that you see with the adult corpses.
Mm-hmm. Yes, in the particular case of chimpanzees, and I hope I'm remembering this correctly, but I think I've heard of instances where people have observed, for example, a group of chimpanzees finding the corpse of an adult chimpanzee and then trying to, for example, lift its arms and hands to see if, I guess, with the intention of seeing if it would react or if it would still be alive, and then supposedly exhibiting behaviors that would be similar to grieving or something like that.
Yeah, it gets really tricky to not use anthropocentric terms when we're trying to describe these behaviors. And it's very, yeah, I like the shortcut that it can give you, but they're very loaded terms. But it does seem that certainly when they come across an individual who is deceased, they respond very differently to an individual who would be sleeping, for example. And I don't know. Yeah, then you get into some really interesting questions about what is it about a deceased individual versus a non-deceased individual. Like, do they understand the breathing? Like, is breathing or seeing somebody breathing enough of a cue to know that they're dead, or is there something else that is causing them to treat them in the other way, in a different way? So it gets really, really tricky really quickly when we start thinking about or trying to interpret, like, why are they lifting an arm or peering very closely. It does seem that they're trying to gather as much information about the situation as possible, because it's a confronting situation. Like, there's an individual, something that looks alive but is acting like, looks like an agent. It looks like it should be alive and is acting like an object. That's a very cognitively dissonant idea to have it in its head.
But the fact that they are able to distinguish between an individual that is simply sleeping and a dead individual would probably already point to something. I mean, not something very concrete or specific, of course, but at least to the fact that they notice something about the body that leads them to be able to distinguish between those two different states, I guess.
Yeah, I would really like to know. So I have some ideas for some experiments that I'm on the fence about the ethics of them. Like, I wouldn't want to present anything that looks like a known individual to a group of primates. But I think it would be very interesting to look at, if you gave them something that looks like a real object, not a baboon necessarily, but looks like it should be alive and doesn't act like it's alive, like, what responses are you going to get from them in that case? Like, what is it that they're paying attention to that is making them respond in the way they do to these corpses? And I think you could do some interesting experiments, like tweaking the stimuli to see, like, is it because it has fur? Is it because it has eyes? Is it because it has the general bowel plan, like the body plan of an animal? that makes it look like it should act in a way and it's not. I think there's some interesting work you could do there. It's just trying to find the right balance between something that isn't going to cause them distress, but is going to give you the kinds of responses that you can use to tease apart how they're cognitively processing these stimuli.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to, because you've used the term anthropomorphizing there several times, and I mean, of course, we have to keep that in mind, that sometimes we might do some of that. But on the other hand, I guess that we could say that comparative psychology is a very complicated field, because there's also biological continuity to take into account, and there's certainly also cognitive continuity between species, particularly the ones that are closest to each other, and sometimes even some surprisingly more distant species, like for example, just the work that people have been doing on corvids, for example, and on octopi. I mean, it's amazing how how distant they can be from us and from the great apes, for example, and still share some similar cognitive abilities, at least in some domains. So I mean, it's tricky, right?
Yeah, 100%. I tend to be more on the generous side, and I like, if we're going to use Occam's razor or some kind of parsimony to explain behavior, I would go on the side of exactly what you've suggested. Like there's an evolutionary history, and so it's parsimonious to suggest that the behaviors that we see in our closest living relatives are cognitively similar or the same as what we have. But I agree that it's really, really tricky. Like it's very easy to take the kinds of anecdotes or the kind of data that we use for support for something and then turn it on its head and say that it's just a learned response. And so I think this question of thanatology and like what animals understand about death is one new way of like really trying to understand what's going on in at least in my case primates' minds. Like we have a pretty good idea about theory of mind at the moment, and I think evidence is pointing towards primates having a theory of mind in some corvids as well. And this new field can really push back that boundary of what we understand about others' minds. It's fun.
Yeah, and I mean, when it comes to finding out that some more distantly related species can have, at least as I mentioned, is in certain domains, or in certain domains can be cognitively closer to us than we thought before, also perhaps point to the concept of evolutionary convergence. I mean, because even though they are phylogenetically different, because in certain ways they might have been exposed to similar evolutionary pressures, cognitively they went in also similar ways or got to similar solutions.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
So let me ask you now about the work you've done on animal personality, because that's a very interesting one. I've already talked about animal personality on the show a few times. But I mean, of course, you will have to tell me the specifics here, but apparently you have found some methodological and conceptual issues here.
Yeah, fair enough. I have to preface this with, it's been probably about a decade since I've really done some hardcore work on animal personality. I did it for my PhD, and yeah, just as a bit of background, I spent my entire PhD trying to answer these big questions about personality, like how personality will affect lifetime fitness. In the baboons that I was working on, I was also working on a species of lizard because they're much shorter lived. They're much easier to work on than baboons. And I spent my entire PhD just finding out that I had no idea what I was measuring, and basically finding exactly the opposite to what I was predicting. And in hindsight, I'm very grateful for that. Like, I think I'm a much better scientist I'm a much better scientist now, having had my hypotheses not supported and then going back to the drawing board and trying to interpret what's going on and then thinking of a new way to actually test my new hypothesis. I think that part has been really, really good for my development as a scientist. But right at the end of my PhD, I was pretty unhappy because nothing worked out. And I felt like I spent my entire PhD just trying to finding out that I didn't know what I was measuring and realizing that actually most people in the field at that point, which was back a decade ago, didn't really know what they were doing. It was a new field. We were all going out and measuring what we could without really thinking about what it meant for the animals that we were working on. And I was 100% guilty of doing that. It's just that I didn't find what I predicted, so I questioned the whole thing.
Great, but I mean, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges when it comes to studying animal personality?
Yeah, so I'm going to take a little bit of a step back for that one. There are two ways to study it. So one is top down and the other one is bottom up. And I think with the top down one, you take a more holistic view of personality as a whole. And this is what psychologists have generally been doing in humans. You can ask humans how they think about things and they can fill in a personality questionnaire. And actually those personality questionnaires, they're very well validated. So the same person will answer the same thing more or less across their life. There's some change as the life progresses, but in general, like somebody who's outgoing when they're younger will be outgoing when they're older as well. And you can ask other people to rate people's personalities using these questionnaires, and that is also quite consistent. Like other people are generally good raters of or perceivers of others' personalities. So there's the psychological problem. The problem with animal personality is that you can't give an animal a questionnaire. You can give people who are familiar with animals a questionnaire, and the psychologists have done that. So the psychologists have asked keepers in zoos or field workers who are familiar with animals to fill in a very, very large questionnaire for their animals, and then you can get very similar results to what you find in humans from the psychology side. Behavioral ecology doesn't work like that. We look at behavior and we tend to focus on one behavior at a time. So it's very rare for somebody to measure everything that an animal is doing. It's really hard to do that and then turn that into something that means something for personality. And so I think the biggest problem or the biggest hurdle for people in behavioral ecology who are studying animal personality is how to build up a holistic idea of animal personality when we're measuring one or two behaviors at a time. That was the big conceptual problem that we had. The other one that we had was that we thought we were measuring some things with the experiments or the behaviors that we were recording. And when you try to, it's called validation, when you try to find another measure that measured the same thing to get the same result, there was no validation there. And so the other conceptual issue that I highlighted in my PhD was that we might be trying to measure something, but we're very frequently not, and we're not doing the kinds of validations that psychology has been doing for decades already. Yeah.
And what about methodologically? What are the issues there?
No, so that they kind of they go hand in hand, those conceptual ones with the methodological ones. So the methodological ones are, again, like I've already mentioned, this validations. We have this problem with not validating what we're doing, but we also have an idea of what we think we're measuring with these experiments. So, for example, I wanted to measure boldness in the baboons, and so what I did was give them a novel food, and then I gave them a predator model. Like I got it's not a predator, a threat. I got a taxidermied snake, and I put the taxidermied snake in front of them. I put the novel food in front of them, and if I was measuring boldness with those two measures, then they should correlate with one another, and they didn't. So I was measuring different things. Most people don't do multiple measures of something. So methodologically, they'll have one experiment, they'll get one measure, and they'll call that boldness without doing the extra experiments that you need to show that this really is boldness, and not just activity or neophilia, like attraction to novel objects, for example. So that the other methodological problem is that most of the experiments that we design will measure multiple personality traits because we are holistic beings that
right.
work all together. And it's very difficult to isolate just one measure with one experiment because multiple things are interacting to create the behavior that you observe. So methodologically, those are the problems that I think that were inherent in the field, and I suspect still are, because it's just the easier, faster, cheaper way to do behavioral ecology research in personality.
So when it comes to studying animal behavior, the few times I talked about this on the show with people about studying animal behavior in the lab and in the wild, I mean, this issue also always came to the table. That is, are we measuring the same things in the wild and in the lab?
I think I have to say no, because well, I'm motivated to say no because I prefer doing things in the wild. Like, I think it's much more ecologically relevant, and you get what really matters, but it's just not very controllable. So there's so many more influences in the wild. So your question is, are you measuring the same thing? I think in most conditions, no, because you just can't set them up to be the same kind of thing. I can give an animal like a novel object in a zoo and in the wild, but in a zoo, that individual doesn't have the same kinds of nutritional needs as the individual in the wild, and so they have, well, like the zoo animal has a lot more time and can do what it wants with it because it has the resources to do that, and in the wild they can't. So even the simplest thing where you're just giving an object to an individual, you can't, it's not the same just because their needs are different in the wild to in captivity.
Yeah, and perhaps, I mean, the information we can draw by studying animals and people, for that matter, in the lab, is that perhaps what we can say is that the animals or the person behaves or tend to behave in a particular way in those kinds of setting.
Yeah,
right? That's perhaps what we can say.
Yeah, it's really tricky because for some of the cognition experiments that I think are really, like all of the stuff that's done with corvids is very well done. Yeah. And I think that you can do that in the lab, and I think that does generalize. Like, I think, for example, the theory of mind stuff and the stuff on pilfering in the scrub jays that Nikki Clayton did, I think that is a beautiful example of how you can use an experiment in the lab to prove something that you think is going on in the wild. Or you have evidence for it going on in the wild, but you need those controlled conditions. And so I totally agree with the problem with the lab stuff being context specific, but I also see the value of it. And I like it when research complements one another. But in terms of animal personality, I think it's a really tricky one because you just can't set the tests up in the same way, just to come full circle.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, I wasn't trying to suggest that that research done in the lab or experiments are not valid at all. I was just saying that perhaps, I mean, we can gain information, but it's information that is more constrained, let's say, or more limited. I mean, of course, we can learn that if animals or people are exposed to this or that stimulus, just to give an example, they react this or that way. Okay, yeah, that's knowledge, but it's within those constraints.
Yeah, 100%. No, I wasn't at all trying to suggest that you weren't suggesting that we weren't gaining anything from lab work. I think I wanted to make the link that lab work and field work can inform one another. And I think people very frequently will dismiss lab studies because they're lab studies and say, well, that's context specific. And I think the point that I was trying to make was that they're both valuable. Yeah, that's it.
Fair enough. So, and what about how personality might influence other aspects of animal behavior and psychology? So, for example, do we know if it predicts decision making?
Yes. so we do have some evidence for that. My research, what I wanted to do during my PhD was to try and understand that, like whether personality predicts decision making. So it was my postdoc where I actually did the experiments and the data collection to test that. So at least in baboons, and I think this is true across several species now, if you measure personality in some context, you can use that response to predict what an individual is going to do in another context, and in particular in decision making.
And what about social learning? Is it also influenced by personality traits?
Yeah. So in terms of it relates to the decision making. So just for a bit of background for those listeners who aren't super familiar with behavioral ecology, there are two ways that social animals can get information. So they can either get information themselves by sampling the environment. So you can eat a novel food to see if it's edible or palatable or delicious or going to kill you. Or you can pay attention to what others are doing and learn from them. And actually and certainly in primates, most dietary information is socially learned. Like the younger infants are watching what the others around them are eating, and that's socially learned. When it comes to novel foods, at least in the baboons, their personality will influence how much they rely on using personal or social information. So the bolder individuals are more likely to interact with novel foods and have that really good information about it, whereas shyer individuals will pay attention to what others are doing and will learn about novel foods in that way. And a bold individual, if they interact with a food to start with and then decide that it's not edible, they won't pay any attention to what others do subsequently. So they'll I guess in their heads, they've thought, I've collected some information about that. I've decided that that's not edible, and I'm not going to change my mind even if I see another individual eating that food. And they'll do that with something that is super delicious. For example, like I've given the baboons dried apricots, which I think are quite tasty, and are definitely not nearly as bitter as the things that they eat in the field. But if an individual has interacted with that food, it doesn't matter how many individuals they'll see after that interacting with it. If they're bold individuals, they won't eat it.
So through, and I'm asking you this now because in a bit we're going to talk about culture. So through a behavioral ecological perspective, of course, perhaps this question is a bit unfair to ask just in general terms, but perhaps we should be talking about specific species in specific ecological contexts. But do you think that it is possible to know the factors that play a role in explaining why certain kinds of behaviors the animals tend to prefer to learn by themselves, or the ones that they try to learn socially? You mentioned dietary information there, for example, but is it possible to have an understanding of why certain behaviors perhaps they try to, or why certain information they try to acquire by themselves or learn from others?
It's a really good question. I don't know if I have a good, I've thought about this a lot in terms of culture. I think most people would argue that baboons aren't cultural. And so I think I need to skip back to describe what culture is to be able to answer that question. Is that okay? Can I do that?
No, of course, we would be getting into it in a second, but yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
Well, we can hold off, and I can answer that question maybe once we've had the discussion about culture, because you've opened a whole can of worms.
Yeah, I know.
Sorry for that.
Okay. So perhaps give me just the opportunity to rephrase my previous question. So, do you think it's possible through a behavioral ecological perspective to know what kinds of information individuals from particular species would tend to acquire by themselves versus the kinds of information they would tend to try to learn from others?
It's really hard to do. I think there's only one researcher who has tried to do this without experiments. I think it's very difficult to tease apart what is personal information, what is social information, because they gather both at the same time. And there's one research group, Susan Perry, who works on capuchins in Costa Rica. I don't know how she's done this, because her capuchins are so difficult to see, and the data protocol that she uses is so intense. But she has basically recorded every time that these particular individuals have looked at others, have collected their own information, like who they're looking at, what they're observing, what they're trying out themselves. It's phenomenal, the data that she has. And I mean, hats off to her. It's really, that's the only data set that I know that exists that would be able to answer that question, like how much is social and how much is personal. And like we put it as if it's a dichotomy, but as I suggested, like they're doing both. Like I think they just differ in how much, well, individuals differ depending on how old they are and their personality, on how much weight they put on social versus personal information. And the older you get, the more you know about the world, the less you find value in social information, because you have all of the information that you need to get to a point in your life where you're having babies. So like there's no real point in collecting any more information, or collecting social information, or updating your personal information. It also depends on the species. There are some species that are just way more inventing than others. And some species, like chimpanzees, for example, who are extremely conservative in their behavior and don't try new things very often.
Yeah, that's why I said earlier that perhaps my question was a bit unfair, because we would probably have to look on a case-by-case basis across different species and talk about specific species in probably specific ecological contexts, and also trying, of course, to tease apart, if that's even possible, what's, I guess, innate to particular individuals versus what is influenced by the ecological circumstances they live in. I mean, that's also another issue, probably.
Yeah, 100%. I think there's some, I can't recall them, but I think there's some really interesting experiments trying to give captive animals who have had no experience of, for example, tool use, tools to innovate new behaviors. So there does seem to be some kind of species difference in inventability and the kinds of things that animals can invent. There's a researcher called Claudio Tenia who has this idea, he calls it the zone of latent solutions. And he says that in everything but humans, there's just a realm of things that can be invented by that species. And so you find the same things being invented over and over and over again. And then in terms of the culture argument, it's very difficult to know, is it really cultural if everybody can invent something? It just depends on how you define culture.
Yeah, but by the way, I have an interview on the show with Dr. Claudio Tenia. So for the viewers or listeners out there, and I'm about to do a second one with him just in a few days. So
perfect.
Yeah. So, but okay, so just one last question about personality before we move on to culture then. To what extent do you think we can compare personality across different species? Because of course, I mean, in humans, and this is also very debated, we have the big five, we have the hexacle, we have all of that. And of course, then cultural psychologists debate if that's really universal or applies just to the West, for example, blah, blah, blah. So, but comparing personality across species, I would imagine that would be even trickier.
I think it depends on how broad you go. I think it's very difficult to compare great tits, for example, to primates, but at least amongst the primate researchers, particularly in the psychology approach, then you can do cross-species comparisons. You can ask the same kind of questions. And actually, if you have raters who are rating behaviors, if one, like, it's very easy to tell that something doesn't make sense for a species because raters will rate it differently. And so you're looking for validity in the items that you put into these personality surveys. And then you can compare across species. It's really interesting. So chimpanzees, for example, they have the same big five as humans plus an extra sixth, which is dominance, which makes sense for their social system. So depending on depending on the approach that you use and how broad you're casting your net, then I think it is possible to compare, at least closely related species that behave more or less in the same way-ish, in the same environment-ish. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so what is culture then? Because that's really, I guess, the starting question here. And do you think that even evolutionary biologists, behavioral ecologists agree on what culture is?
No, I think there's no broad agreement. There are some authors that are more prolific than others, and so you'll see the same definition, like some definitions more frequently than others. I think, at least in behavioral ecology or from the non-human animal culture perspective, most people would define culture as a behavior that is socially learned, transmits across generations, and results in population differences in behavior. Okay. The problem with this definition, though, is that it was basically created to make it possible to show that there is culture in chimpanzees. So it's quite difficult to go. It's tautological. It goes round and round in circles. So we assume that if behavior is culturally learned, then there should be differences between populations. And so we put that as part of the definition, but also part of the evidence. And you can't do that. Like you can't have a definition that depends on the evidence and the evidence that depends on the definition. That's not very good evidence for something for something really. But that's what we could do, because we couldn't do tests to find that something was socially learned. So we infer that it's socially learned by showing that there are differences between populations. And then we say that that's culture because there are differences between populations. So it's a bit circular. I have lots of problems with the definition, but I don't have a good solution. So the only thing that I think all definitions have is that it has to be a socially learned behavior.
Mm-hmm. I mean, of course, this ties to many different complicated questions, because, of course, we talk about culture also when we have debates about nature versus nurture. Yeah. I mean, if a particular behavior is part of the evolved repertoire of a particular species and it really is not really socially transmitted or doesn't depend much on the ecological conditions. Of course, that's, I guess, a bit weird, because I wouldn't imagine that there's any behavior out there that doesn't depend at all on the ecological conditions the animals live in, and then where culture comes from, if it's just novel behaviors in response to particular ecological conditions, for example, or if something else. I mean, it's very complicated, but also fascinating. But another question that I would like to ask you now is, does culture always require the social transmission of information?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know what else culture would be if it wasn't socially transmitted. If it was genetic, like if there are differences that weren't socially transmitted, then we would assume that it was a genetic thing. So yes, I think that is the only part of the definition of culture that I think is that works, that is strong. I will say that there's some problems with I don't know, like if you're trying to think about trying to take ecology out of it is really, really difficult. So for example, in the baboons, they're a generalist species. They tend to eat lots of different things, and their diet varies because their ecology varies. There was a really interesting study done by a baboon researcher who translocated her troop of baboons, and they had to basically learn to eat learn to eat in this new environment that they hadn't been in before. They had to find water, they had to find sleeping sites, and they did it socially. They paid attention to it. Like there was a lot of innovation, like individuals trying things out that looked like that it would be edible, but there was a lot of paying attention to other troops and following other troops to water, for example. But nobody argues that baboons are cultural or have cultural behaviors, because they're such a generalist species, and they tend to innovate things frequently, and the behavior spreads really, really rapidly. What I think we mean when we say culture is that there are there's some kind of conformity, that individuals in a group are behaving in a particular way because they're members of that group. And the only things that I can think of that work for that definition are things that do not have any impact on their survival, so that they're completely arbitrary. And so one example of that is the hand clasp grooming that the chimpanzees do. So some chimpanzees they'll hand clasp like this, or they hand clasp like this, or they don't do hand clasping at all. And it's arbitrary. It doesn't matter whether they do it or not, or how they do it. That seems like good evidence of a cultural behavior, but that's only because it doesn't affect their reproductive success. The problem for something like baboons, where most of the innovations come in the foraging realm, it really matters whether they're processing food efficiently or not. And so you don't get between group differences in this, because novel behaviors are transmitted really rapidly, like in one generation. For example, that like the sweet potato washing, I think you could use as an example there. Like within one generation, everybody's eating sweet potatoes. So the fact is, like if you don't catch like a novel food being introduced into a diet, then you won't know that it's a culturally transmitted trait. Sorry, that's my soapbox for ecology.
No. Of course, and I mean about the role of ecology. Just to comment that. I mean, one thing that really changed my mindset, the way I look at things and understand the importance of and attribute importance to ecology here, was when I was once talking with someone who does work on primatology. I can't remember exactly who it was now, but I was asking some specific question about the social structure of chimpanzees, and the person said, but what chimpanzees are you talking about? Because chimpanzees from that site in Africa have a particular social structure. Chimpanzees from the other side in Africa have another social structure, because in that site there's these ecological conditions, and the other side those, and so I was like, oh, okay, so even when we're talking about chimpanzee behavior, it's not that there's sort of that all chimpanzees across Africa, for example, are behaving or organizing their society in exactly the same ways.
Yeah, I think some of the really interesting examples of culture in terms of the arbitrariness come down to the whale song and communication. So that there's some really lovely work done by the group that studies humpback whales, looking at how their song changes. It evolves. Like there's this cultural evolution of song through time, and it's arbitrary. Like nobody knows what the females are attracted to, but presumably it's novelty if they're changing their song constantly, and so they just steal songs. So for the east coast of Australia, those humpback whales steal songs from the west coast of Australia, and then it travels across the Pacific. It's a beautiful example of an arbitrary cultural behavior in a very large mammal.
And what happens when there are constraints on social transmission?
Yeah, so that's work that I did in the baboons. So I think most people know baboons. It's certainly, most people know that baboons are very hierarchical. They have a very strict and linear dominance hierarchy, and that really affects who can learn from whom. And actually, it's the opposite that you would expect. So in chimpanzees, for example, there's some evidence that being high ranking means that others will pay attention to you. And that might be true for the baboons as well. The problem is that the high ranking individuals just don't pay any attention to the low ranking individuals. So they feel like they have nothing to learn from a low ranking individual, but they're the ones that innovate more behaviors. And so the low ranking individuals have more to gain from finding new food sources and tend to learn from one another, whereas the high-ranking individuals just ignore them. So at least in the baboons, there are constraints on who will learn from whom. And because the way that information transmits or travels through social networks, it could mean that a novel behavior, even if it's highly adaptive, just won't transmit to the rest of the troop if it's like stuck in this little pocket of a social network. Like if there's a bunch of low-ranking individuals who are doing it, nobody's paying attention to them, then very beneficial behavior won't transmit. And we tend not to look at that initial transmission. Like, we model it a lot, and we have some data in humans about that initial transmission, but we can't get those data very often in animal populations. Like, it's very rare to be like the one who observes something happen. It's happened a few times, for example, in lobtail feeding in the humpback whales, and there's the milk bottle opening by great tits, where there was this innovation of picking the milk bottles open to get at the cream at the top. And that was innovated in multiple places and then spread socially, or we assume spread socially afterwards. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. And I have, okay, so I have another sort of question also about culture and cultural evolution.
Yeah.
What is the role played by invention?
Invention?
Yeah.
Ooh, it's a good one. So without invention, you can't have any cultural evolution. So nothing will change if nothing is invented. And I think we take for granted, because we're humans and we invent a lot, that things will be invented, but we don't actually understand very much about invention at all. First of all, it's really hard to define. It's really difficult to quantify whether something is truly novel. Like, you don't know when an animal invents something, whether that's the first time they've ever done it. Like, it's really, again, Susan Perry with the capuchins is the only person who has, like, she has a decade of data on novel behaviors and invention. But at least in non-human animals, it's really difficult to understand who's doing what inventing. But without invention, you can't have culture, you can't have cultural evolution, nothing. We don't know anything about that basic building block. We've got a lot of models, and we've got a lot of data from humans, but not really anything from animals, which is pretty insane.
Yeah. Okay, so I have one last topic I would like to ask you about that is unrelated to primatology and animal personality and behavior and all of that. I mean, we are also animals, but anyway.
But it's a quite different one.
Yeah, so you've also done some work and tried to raise awareness about some, I guess we could call them, challenges that women face in academia, particularly women's visibility in academic seminars, for example. So could you tell us about that and what happens in that kind of context?
Yeah, so this actually all stemmed out of I was at a talk in a psychology department with a male colleague of mine, and we were both from zoology. We'd gone into psychology to look at a talk about how there were no sex differences in mental rotation tasks in males and females, unless you told females that they're not as good at doing that as men. And after the seminar, I commented about how, because obviously the sex and gender was at the forefront of the talk, I was thinking about it in terms of the questions that were asked afterwards. And the majority of the questions were asked by men. Actually, I think there were only 3 questions asked, and they were all from men. And my colleague turned to me and he was like, well, yeah, that's terrible, but have you seen the split in the audience? And it was probably 70% women in the audience. And so we made this observation that in this particular context, when there was a talk about gender, there were more questions from men than in women. And we wondered how ubiquitous this was. Turns out that it is quite ubiquitous. We got colleagues from all over the world to attend seminars and then count the number of people count the number of different genders presented by people in the audience, and then the question askers. And we found something absolutely ridiculous. I think it's like men are 2.5 times as likely to ask a question as women. We also found that, and this has been repeated multiple times, that if a woman is the first one to ask a question, then there is more likely going to be a gender balance in the questions asked afterwards. And so our recommendations from that first study were to encourage women to ask the first question, or at least make people aware that there is this bias and try to counter it. Really good moderation of a seminar will mean that there's better representation of women in the question asking period. And we argue in our paper that this really matters. Obviously there's a gender disparity in the speakers as well, although it's not as big as you would think. It's changing.
And that gender disparity is also skewed toward men?
Towards men. But I guess that's less surprising because there's a gender disparity in the number of male versus female academics in most subjects, not all of them, obviously, but and the more senior you go, the more the gender disparity is biased towards male than female researchers. And so I guess that it's getting much better. Like some of the recent research we've done is it's around 45% females, 55% males in some subjects, which is great. Really, really interestingly, we had some comments in that original study saying that it's not just that men are asking questions, but they're asking questions in a very male way. So they're taking up space, taking up time. They ask really long-winded questions, or they'll make a statement, or they're very gendered ideas about there being differences between men and women. So in a subsequent study, my colleagues and I, we took the ideas from that original study and we wanted to show that there is a gender difference. Turns out that we replicated the original results. So men and women think that men and women ask questions differently, and women more than men. So women think that there is a bigger bias, but men also think that there's a bias in how questions are asked. This isn't published yet, by the way, it's under review or about to be resubmitted. So we then looked at, I think, something like 912 questions. We wrote down what the questions were. So we had just the words and not the genders. There are no differences in at least the words that people are saying. You can't really tell from a question that's written down whether it's asked by a male or a female. So this is all ideas that we have in our head. It's all, we think that men and women ask questions differently, but on paper, we don't. And so I think we have a lot to learn from these two studies, that men are far more visible, but we also think that men should be far more visible. And we think that men are being more visible in a way that isn't actually true or is not reflected by the data that we have at the moment. So I think at least us as an academic community has a lot of work to do to identify our biases and pay attention to where there are and are not biases, but also to acknowledge that women aren't speaking up even when they want to, because we think that there are biases. It's a horrible little a horrible loop that we should be able to get out of, because actually when you write down the questions there, we ask them the same way.
So in that particular case, then the ideas or stereotypes we have about how men and women tend to express themselves, those are inaccurate stereotypes. Yes. So I have to caveat that with, we don't have the expression. We've written down the words, and we don't have how a question is delivered, like whether it's delivered aggressively or not. Okay. But when you have just the words written down, men and women have the same number of words that we use for questions. We have the same expressions. We have the same, I think the only difference that we found was that women are more likely to thank the speaker or to say hello. There's one thing that we do of the 9 to 12 different things that we quantified. Women do one thing different, and it's not what you would expect. So let me ask you just one last question about those studies. Yeah. So did you try to understand where that phenomenon comes from? I mean, this disparity in terms of how much women, participate verbally, I guess, in seminars versus men, how much they participate in the debates and so on. Did you try to understand where that stems from? If it's from some sort of, expectations related to gender, if it's the result of some sort of socialization or some other thing? Yeah, so we put it in the context of, in psychology, what's called a fear of backlash. That women who, the idea is that that speaking up at a seminar is what we would say is taking up space. We don't want to be seen as doing what we think are male stereotypic behaviors, even if that's not the case. And so there was, like, in the survey that we conducted, there was backlash. So people
So women who asked a male stereotypic question, we engineered these male stereotypic questions, were judged as less friendly than women, these hypothetical women who asked these female stereotypic questions. So there is backlash against women for enacting what we perceive as male stereotypic behaviors. The important thing is that they're like, in the words that we say, there's no such thing as a male or a female stereotypic questions. They're just questions. There's no difference between them. Really, really interestingly, I got given this corpus of questions and I had to make. We used the questions that we had recorded in the survey that we did, and I had to make male and female versions of questions, and I could not do it. I couldn't find a male question. I couldn't find a female question. I just got questions, and then I put in extra bits that made it from what our respondents had told us, made something male or female. So I couldn't even do it, and I've been studying question asking for a long time. So it was quite a surprising result, but a really good positive one to highlight to people that there really isn't a difference. Don't be afraid of backlash, because we all ask questions the same way.
So I mean, the solution here would be that just telling people, women specifically in this case, that they shouldn't be afraid of backlash.
Yeah, I think it's tough to tell people to act in a particular way, because I'm even nervous of asking questions after seminars. So I do not practice what I preach. I think that what we can say is that you could be aware of who's asking questions and who's given space to talk. But just to know that there's no such thing as a male question, so don't judge people for acting in any one way. And both men and women can do this. Like, I'm not putting the responsibility on any one sex or gender.
Oh yeah, so in this case, the backlash could have come from both men and women.
100%, and more from women, actually. More from women. So women perceive a bigger gender difference than men. So women are much more attuned to these stereotypes than men were in our survey data.
Yeah, that's all very interesting. So, Dr. Carter, just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
I have a website that I update maybe once a year. It's called draleciacarter.strikingly.com. I'm also on Twitter. I think it's Alecia_Carter. But I really only post to tell people about, sometimes about my research, but about the seminar series that we run at UCL. Okay, I'm very present.
Okay, great. So I'm leaving links to that in the description box of the interview. And thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's been really fun to talk to you.
No, it's been an absolute delight. And thank you for asking such interesting questions and being patient enough with me when I digress.
Thank you. Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please do not forget to like it, share, comment, and subscribe. And if you like more generally what I'm doing, please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. You have all of the links in the description of this interview. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Erga Larsen, Jerry Muller, Hans Fredrik Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Visser, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Henrik Alenia, John Connors, Philip Force Connolly, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Simon Columbus, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel Andreff, Francis Ford, Tiago Dunes, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Weira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correa, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hallman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Panos Cortez, Ursula Litska, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Morten Eklund, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Olsen, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Amaury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Holt Ericbun, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Gressis, Tom Roth, DRPMD, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Richard Bowen, Thomas Dobner, Luke Neeson, Chris Story, Manuel Oliveira, Kimberly Johnson, and Benjamin Galbart. A special thanks to my producers, Cesar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Hugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Robert Lewis, and Al Nick Ortiz, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadrian, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.